In 1829, in the haunted borderlands of Sussex County, Delaware, a farmer's spade struck something that wasn't stone, something that wasn't root, and it broke the silence of a generation. The earth gave up a secret it had been forced to keep. Small bones, fragile and unmistakably human, tangled in the dirt like a forgotten prayer. And with that single, chilling discovery, the whispers that had clung to the swamps and pine thickets for 20 years. Whispers of children who vanished on their way home, of travelers who checked into a tavern and were never seen again, of muffled cries from the backs of wagons rolling south in the dead of night. All of it suddenly had a name. That name was not some shadowy phantom or a band of ruthless men. It was a woman, Patty Cannon, and the ground giving up its dead was her own front yard. For 2 decades, she had presided over one of the most sophisticated, most brutal human trafficking networks in American history. A machine that didn't just break laws, it inverted them. It was a reverse underground railroad, a dark mirror to the path of freedom, engineered not for escape but for capture. She didn't just enslave the fugitive, she hunted the free. She turned liberty into a commodity, a name on a piece of paper that could be stolen and burned, erasing a life as easily as ash is scattered by the wind. When the gears of her profit machine required it, she didn't just erase a name, she erased the person, burying the evidence just steps from her own door. She would be indicted for 4 murders, but the whispers, the rumors, the bones themselves, they spoke of dozens more. A number so vast it became a kind of myth, a horror story told to frighten children. But this was no myth. This was a system, hidden in plain sight, powered by greed and protected by a conspiracy of silence so profound it poisoned the very land. She would never face a jury. She would never answer for the empire of suffering she built. Instead, her story ends with a vial of poison in a lonely jail cell, leaving the full, terrifying truth to rot in the archives of absence she herself had created. You're not supposed to know the mechanics of how a society can agree to forget. Tonight, we follow the shadow. We step into the archive of the erased. To understand how a woman like Patty Cannon could exist, you first have to understand the land that made her. The border between Delaware and Maryland in the early 19th century wasn't a line on a map, it was a wound. A blurred, festering edge of civilization that bled into swamps, dense pine barrens, and sandy, forgotten roads. Here, the law wasn't a principle, it was a negotiation. Jurisdiction was a matter of convenience, a game of shadows played by sheriffs who knew their authority dissolved the moment they stepped over an invisible line in the dirt. This was liminal ground, a place belonging to neither state and therefore to no one. And in that vacuum of power, opportunity didn't just knock, it festered. The land itself was an accomplice. The shallow marshes of the Delmarva Peninsula were designed for disappearance. They swallowed hoofprints whole. The thick, dark pine forests could absorb a wagon's tracks and muffle a scream. The rain would turn the sandy roads back into an anonymous, untraceable wilderness within hours. Pursuing a fugitive, or a kidnapper, across this landscape was a fool's errand. It was a place built for secrets to be kept. At the very heart of this ambiguous territory, this no-man's land of law, was an intersection known as Johnson's Crossroads. It was little more than a handful of cabins and a single, looming tavern, the only permanent structure for miles. It stood like a predator's lure, its lantern light a false promise of safety for stagecoaches, laborers, and anyone unfortunate enough to be traveling alone after dusk. Taverns were meant to be points of rest, of community. But this one was different. It wasn't a stop along the way. It was a funnel, a place where the road in was always wider than the road out. Johnson's Crossroads was an artery of a shadow economy, and Patty Cannon's tavern was its black heart, pumping stolen lives southward into the insatiable markets of the Deep South. The landscape didn't just make her work possible, it disguised its scale, its horror. Every swamp was a potential graveyard. Every river crossing was a point of no return. Every ferryman who looked the other way was another link in the chain. This wasn't her invention. The borderland had always rewarded those who knew how to leverage its silence, but she perfected it. She weaponized the geography, turning its legal ambiguity into a ruthlessly efficient engine of profit. Where freedom was just a line on a map, Patty Cannon made her fortune by erasing it. Imagine a community living on a razor's edge. This was the world surrounding Johnson's Crossroads, a fragile ecosystem of freedom, populated by free black families who had painstakingly purchased their liberty, or inherited it through the scattered, inconsistent acts of manumission from dying planters. Their farms were small, almost an afterthought, narrow strips of corn and tobacco clinging to the edges of the vast plantations that still dominated the landscape. For them, freedom wasn't a right, it was a possession, and like any possession, it could be stolen. Their proof of liberty was nothing more than a folded, worn piece of parchment, a certificate bearing a name, an age, and a seal. It was their only shield against a world that saw them as an anomaly, a commodity temporarily out of place. And in the borderlands, that shield was made of paper. The border offered them no protection. It was, in fact, the pretext for their destruction. A free man stopped on the Maryland side of the line could be claimed as a fugitive slave from Delaware, his papers dismissed as forgeries. The same man, taken on the Delaware side, could vanish into a labyrinth of paperwork that no one in Maryland cared enough to verify. The ambiguity of the law was a weapon pointed directly at them. The infrastructure of the land conspired with this legal chaos. Ferries operated along the Nanticoke and Choptank rivers, their flatboats wide enough to carry wagons laden with goods. But what were those goods? Travelers years later would speak of wagons crossing only at night, the canvas pulled so tight it seemed to be holding something in. They spoke of the sound of chains, a rhythmic, metallic scrape, barely masked by the creaking of the wooden wagon wheels. The ferrymen, they never asked. They were paid not for passage, but for their silence, for their ability to not see what was right in front of them. Once across the river, the wagons turned south, their tracks vanishing into the pine barrens and the sandy, forgiving soil. Johnson's Crossroads thrived on this system of deliberate ignorance. To a stranger passing through, it was just a quiet intersection, a place where roads converged on their way to somewhere else. But to those who lived in its shadow, it was known as a place of endings. A place where people simply ceased to be. Few spoke of it openly. The fear was too thick, too present, but everyone knew. Everyone had heard of the families fractured by a sudden, inexplicable absence. The children sent on an errand who never came home. The laborers who walked down that road and were never seen again. The marsh didn't just conceal tracks, it concealed memory, erasing lives with a patience the official archives would later mimic perfectly. You are not to ask what is in the wagon. You are only to take it to the other side. The less you know, the longer you will live to carry other wagons. This was the whispered creed of the borderland ferrymen, a rumor passed down through generations. It wasn't a threat from Patty Cannon. It was the unwritten law of the land itself, a law of profitable silence. This was the terrain Patty Cannon inherited. A world already rife with moral decay, with systems of disappearance just waiting for a master organizer to weaponize them. She didn't invent the darkness. She gave it a headquarters. By positioning her tavern at this critical junction, this nexus of legal confusion and geographic concealment, she transformed the land's inherent uncertainty into a brutally consistent source of income. What was merely a transitional space to most, a place to pass through, became her personal hunting ground. The landscape wasn't just a backdrop to her crimes, it was an active participant. Each swamp concealed a trail leading south. Each river crossing erased a record of passage. Each silent ferryman was a bookkeeper for a ledger that would never be written down. To truly understand how she prospered for so long, you have to understand how the land itself, its very essence, conspired with her. Here, on the bleeding edge of Delaware and Maryland, authority was always for sale, and a human life could be stolen, sold, and erased without a single soul being held to account. The system was already in place. The fear was already seated. The complicity was already normalized. All it needed was a catalyst. All it needed was a mind ruthless enough to see the design in the chaos. A mind that could look at a swamp and see a vault. A mind that could look at a river and see an accomplice. A mind that could look at a human being, a free man with a family and a future, and see only the glint of coin. If freedom had a line on a map, Paddy Cannon built an empire by proving just how easily that line could be washed away by the tide, or buried under the dirt, or simply ignored by men who were paid well enough to look the other way. The land was her first and most loyal conspirator. It held her secrets long after she was gone, and even today it refuses to give them all up. To a stranger, she was just a tavern keeper. Middle-aged, her face a roadmap of hard years, etched with a severity that no one ever mistook for warmth. Those who lived nearby, those who survived to remember her, described a woman who was hard-faced, deliberate, almost unnervingly still in her movements. She commanded a room not with words but with a palpable weight, an aura of authority that men twice her size seemed to instinctively obey. No one could recall ever seeing her smile. The silence she carried with her was heavier, more profound than any threat. Her tavern stood at that crossroads, a simple structure of wood and plaster, with a few outbuildings scattered in the yard like forgotten children. By day it could have been any rural inn along any American road, its benches filled with weary travelers, dusty wagoners, and local farmhands exchanging gossip over cheap ale. But when the sun went down, the building itself seemed to hold its breath. The windows were shuttered tight, the doors barred from within. It ceased to be an inn and became a fortress of secrets. There were rooms, it was said, that no paying guest was ever shown, hidden compartments built between the walls narrow as a coffin, lofts where the floorboards were packed with earth and straw to muffle the sound of a human voice. Contemporary accounts, whispered long after she was gone, spoke of these hidden chambers, of iron rings bolted directly into the wooden beams, waiting. To some, her tavern was a place of rest. To others, it was the end of the world. The building itself wore a mask of normalcy. The public rooms were plain, furnished with rough-hewn tables, chipped crockery, and the ever-present smell of wood smoke from the hearth. It was the epitome of the ordinary, and that was her genius. The horror wasn't in the spectacle. It was hidden behind the mundane. Those who knew, those who really knew, whispered of spaces that defied the building's simple geometry, of floorboards loose enough to be lifted with a single pull, revealing a dark space beneath, of trapdoors disguised under worn-out rugs, of outbuildings whose purpose shifted with the setting of the sun, from storing grain to holding human souls. In a land where taverns were the hubs of rural life, post offices, horse exchanges, social halls, Paddy Cannon's establishment served one more unlisted function. It was a station of disappearance. The visual of her is what haunts the accounts. She rarely spoke. She didn't need to. She would stand behind the bar or sit in a corner and just watch. Her eyes, they said, were sharp and quick like a bird of prey. They would scan a room, taking inventory of every person, every gesture, every whispered conversation, long before anyone realized they were being watched. The impression she left wasn't one of hospitality. It was one of absolute, suffocating control. Men who would bluster and brawl in any other tavern seemed to shrink in her presence, unsettled by her unblinking certainty. She didn't command them. She simply made them understand, without a word, that this was her domain, and the rules were hers alone. Taverns in the early republic were the lifeblood of the countryside. They were where information traveled faster than a horse. Court days, militia musters, elections, they all revolved around these public houses. Business was conducted over a shared meal, contracts signed on tables still sticky with spilled ale. And in this setting, Paddy Cannon's tavern stood at the precise intersection of legality and criminality. In one room, a land deal could be signed and notarized. In the room right next to it, a human being could be waiting in chains, their own life having just been sold in a transaction that left no paper trail. The line between legitimate commerce and human trafficking was so thin, so blurred, that for those who profited from it, it ceased to exist at all. Local rumor sharpened this portrait of quiet menace. Travelers who arrived late at night sometimes spoke of seeing wagons standing idle in her yard, the canvas drawn tight, even on a rainless night. Others heard sounds they couldn't explain, a muffled cry, a sudden thud from an upper room, sounds that seemed to be swallowed by the walls of the tavern itself. If anyone was brave enough or foolish enough to ask, Cannon would dismiss them with a look of such profound contempt that the question would die in their throat. Her neighbors, bound by a web of fear, caution, and perhaps even complicity, repeated little. They simply acknowledged the unspoken truth. She was not a woman to be trifled with. What made her so terrifyingly effective was not her appearance, but her profound ordinariness. She wasn't the theatrical villain folklore would later paint her to be. She was a businesswoman, a stern, silent proprietor who looked like countless other women running taverns along America's roads, except her doors concealed chambers where lives were systematically dismantled. The ordinary face, the plain rooms, the familiar creak of the floorboard, this was the camouflage that gave her power. The horror wasn't in some grand, monstrous spectacle. It was in the chilling, methodical silence of it all. Travelers were never greeted by her smile, only by her silence. And that silence was the sound of a door closing forever. Behind the hard-faced woman in the tavern stood something far more organized, far more insidious than a lone predator. This wasn't the work of one person. It was a family business. What history remembers as the Cannon Johnson gang was, at its core, a household enterprise, structured around kinship and commerce in equal measure. It began with her own blood and expanded outward, link by link, until it resembled less a band of outlaws and more a dark corporation, with its own supply chains, logistics, and distribution network. The business was bound together by her daughter's marriages, strategic alliances that cemented power and expanded the operation's reach. The first was to a man named Henry Brereton, a blacksmith with a reputation for casual brutality and a conviction for kidnapping already on his record. He escaped from prison, a grim foreshadowing of the family's relationship with the law, only to be executed later. His name was a bloody prelude to what the household would become, but it was her daughter's second husband, Joe Johnson, who became the true partner in this enterprise of evil. Johnson wasn't just an accomplice, he was a co-CEO. He and Cannon ran the gang together, his presence transforming what might have been a domestic circle of criminals into a ruthlessly organized syndicate. He was the logistical mind to her strategic command. While Cannon held the tavern as their unbreachable headquarters, Johnson managed the machinery that was always in motion. He was the one who oversaw the wagon routes, carefully plotting paths through the backroads and swamps to avoid detection. He hired the drivers, men as desperate or as cruel as the work required. He ensured that the human cargo was moved with cold, commercial efficiency from the Delaware borderlands to the southern ports where buyers were waiting. Together, Patty Cannon and Joe Johnson created a system that was both flexible enough to adapt to any challenge and merciless enough to endure for 20 years. They were the two heads of a single serpent, one that coiled around the crossroads, squeezing the life out of anyone who fell into its grasp. This was not a chaotic smash-and-grab operation. It was a structured, hierarchical organization built on the bedrock of family ties. Trust was paramount, and who could you trust more than family? This perversion of kinship is what made them so effective. The loyalty, the shared secrets, the unspoken understanding, all the strengths of a family unit were twisted into the service of an empire of pain. What was called family by blood was, in reality, a business bound by chains. The Cannon Johnson gang did not operate in a vacuum. A family, no matter how ruthless, cannot sustain an operation of this magnitude alone. They relied on a loose, unspoken confederation of accomplices, wagoners, ferrymen, and intermediaries who were either paid for their silence or were active, willing participants in the trade. This network was the lifeblood of their business, the arteries and veins that carried stolen lives from the heart of the tavern to the far-flung markets of the South. The ferrymen were the gatekeepers. They guided the heavy wagons across the Nanticoke and Choptank rivers without a single question, their flatboats carrying a human cargo hidden just beneath a thin layer of canvas. They saw everything and said nothing. Their silence was a commodity, purchased with a few coins, ensuring that one world, the world of freedom, was cleanly severed from the next. The wagoners were the couriers. They navigated the back roads, often under the cloak of a moonless night, their wagon wheels creaking a steady, mournful rhythm that marked another mile southward. They were the ones who heard the muffled sobs, who felt the desperate, futile struggles from the back of the wagon, and they kept driving. And then there were the buyers, the respectable merchants and planters in the southern markets who accepted these shipments without hesitation. They didn't ask about free papers. They didn't inquire about a person's origins. Their only concern was the quality of the product. They paid in gold, and that gold traveled back up the chain, link by link, until it landed in the hands of Paddy Cannon back at the tavern at Johnson's Crossroads. The tavern was the undisputed headquarters, the command and control center for this entire operation. Prisoners were held in its hidden rooms, sometimes for days, waiting for the wagons to arrive. Johnson would handle the negotiations with the traders and buyers, setting the prices, arranging the logistics. Cannon would keep order at the tavern, her silent, imposing presence ensuring that every part of the machine ran smoothly. The extended circle of accomplices ensured the transport was seamless. If one driver was arrested or fell ill, another would immediately take his place. The system was resilient, designed to withstand losses. What began as opportunistic kidnappings soon became a chillingly predictable routine. The efficiency itself was a form of terror. A traveling merchant years later would write in a letter, "One does not cross Paddy Cannon. It is said she keeps a ledger not of debts but of slights, and pays them back not in coin, but in disappearances." The line between the gang's domestic life and their criminal enterprise simply did not exist. It was a complete and total fusion of home and horror. The same yard where Cannon's grandchildren played was the same yard where wagons waited, laden with human beings destined for a life of bondage. The outbuildings that should have stored grain or sheltered livestock held terrified captives instead. Family meals were eaten just a few feet away, separated only by a thin plaster wall, from strangers chained in the darkness. The absolute separation between the mundane and the monstrous, the complete dissolution of any boundary between the household and the enterprise is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. It wasn't just a business, it was their way of life. And what bound them together even more tightly than blood was silence. The neighbors knew. Of course they knew. They saw the wagons. They heard the rumors. They noticed the sudden disappearances, but they did not speak. Some were paid for their silence. Others were intimidated into it, but many, perhaps most, were simply complicit through their own inaction. The absence of any recorded protest, any formal complaint, says as much about the community as it does about the gang. Organized crime doesn't thrive on secrecy alone. It thrives on the quiet, tacit consent of those who choose to look the other way, who decide that interfering is too risky, too costly, or simply not their problem. Later folklore would warp the Cannon-Johnson gang into something almost supernatural, a band of larger-than-life monsters, but the truth was colder and far more terrifying. There was no theatrical evil, no spectacle of villainy. There was only the cold, hard, methodical efficiency of a well-run business. Victims taken, papers destroyed, wagons dispatched, buyers waiting, step after methodical step, family after family undone. In the few records that survive, the names of Cannon and Johnson appear most often, but behind them stood a network, a shadow army of unnamed participants, their complicity recorded only in the fragments of whispered testimony. They formed a chain that stretched from a lonely tavern at Johnson's Crossroads to the bustling slave markets hundreds of miles away, and its links were forged not of iron, but of complicity, of silence, and of the cold, hard logic of profit. In the early 19th century, two railroads were being built in America. One was a railroad of hope, the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes and safe houses, of brave souls who risked everything to guide fugitives northward toward the promise of liberty. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But at the exact same time, another railroad was operating in the shadows, a darker, more monstrous system. Paddy Cannon's enterprise was its perfect, horrifying mirror image, a reverse underground railroad that led not toward freedom but back into the depths of bondage. Where one network offered escape, the other engineered capture. Where one erased the chains of slavery, the other forged them anew, clamping them onto the wrists of free men and women. The mechanism was brutally simple and merciless in its execution. All across Delaware and Maryland, in those fragile communities of free black families, life was defined by a single piece of paper. A document, a proof of manumission, was the only thing standing between a man and a life in the cotton fields. It was everything. And paper is a fragile thing. Cannon's gang didn't need to overpower a whole community. They just needed to overpower one person and destroy one piece of paper. They would tear the documents from pockets, from trunks, from the linings of coats, and consign them to the fire. In the space of a single breath, with the flicker of a single flame, a free man's identity was annihilated. Without that proof, he was just a runaway, his word against theirs, his status erased as completely as his name from the page. Once they were seized, the victims entered a system as orderly and as methodical as any legal trade. They were chained in pairs, or sometimes marched in coffles, long lines of human beings yoked together by iron collars around their necks. They were driven southward, under the cover of night, their steps forced into a grim rhythm by the men who held the chains. The same wagons that by day carried tobacco or corn, by night carried a human cargo, hidden from sight beneath a heavy canvas tarp. The same ferries that transported families and livestock across the rivers now carried captives, their operators compensated handsomely not to see what was moving in the shadows. The entire journey was a perversion, a demonic inversion of the flight to freedom. The passage southward wasn't random. It followed the established routes of commerce, directly connecting Paddy Cannon's tavern to the sprawling, insatiable markets of the Deep South. You have to understand the context, the economic engine that made her crime so profitable. In 1808, the United States federally banned the international importation of slaves. On the surface, it seemed like a step toward abolition, but what it actually did was create a massive domestic slave trade. The demand for labor in the cotton and sugar plantations of the South was exploding, and with the African supply chain cut off, the price of enslaved people skyrocketed. A new internal market was born, and it was ravenous. This is the gap that the Cannon-Johnson gang stepped into. They became suppliers for this new domestic economy. The people they kidnapped, the free men, women, and children they stole from the borderlands, were sold into this system as if their freedom had never existed. Their stolen lives helped fuel the economic expansion of the Deep South. Each transaction they made was a moral inversion of the highest order. While abolitionists were risking prosecution and their own lives to guide fugitives to safety, Paddy Cannon was profiting by forcing the free back into chains. The horrifying symmetry of the two systems is what makes it so chilling. The secret roots, the complicit allies, the movement under the cloak of darkness, all the tactics of the Underground Railroad were mirrored, twisted, and used for the opposite purpose. It was not hope that powered these journeys, it was dread. It was not rescue, it was a profound and absolute betrayal. The testimonies that survived, trickling out decades later, all speak of the sheer suddenness of the capture. A man walking home from the market, just a few hundred yards from his own door, suddenly seized by strangers. A child sent on a simple errand to fetch water, who never ever returned. A family sitting down for their evening meal, torn apart in an instant, some left behind in shock, others vanishing into the back of a wagon whose wheels would carry them toward a lifetime of silence. The absence of records was a deliberate strategy. It ensured the permanence of these losses. The parish books didn't mark their disappearance. The census takers didn't carry their names forward. They were simply unrecorded, their lives rewritten, not with ink but with chains. The brutality of the system was not impulsive. It was systemic. It wasn't driven by rage or personal hatred. Victims were not taken for revenge. They were taken for resale. Their value was measured in dollars and cents. In this, Paddy Cannon's gang acted less like a band of rogue criminals on the margins of society and more like active, rational participants in a recognized and protected economy. The buyers in the South, the men who purchased these human beings, they didn't ask how a captive had come to be for sale. They didn't demand a chain of custody. They required only three things: that the body be present, that the chain be secure, and that the price be agreed upon. This was the reverse Underground Railroad, a shadow system, hidden in plain sight, operating along the very same roads, the same ferries, the same rivers as its virtuous counterpart, but driving humanity in the opposite direction. For every path that led northward toward liberty, Paddy Cannon had forged a corresponding path that led southward, straight back into hell. It was a perfectly balanced equation of despair. For every family that found freedom, another was destroyed. For every soul that was saved, another was lost. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine living in a world where the path to freedom and the path to enslavement are the same road, and the direction you travel is determined by nothing more than luck, by who finds you first in the darkness? This is the psychological terror that she unleashed upon the entire community. It wasn't just the fear of being captured. It was the poisoning of the very idea of geography. The road was no longer a path to somewhere else. It was a gamble. The river was no longer a boundary. It was a point of no return. The lantern light of a distant tavern was no longer a sign of safety. It was a lure. She didn't just kidnap people. She kidnapped the landscape itself, turning every feature of the natural world into a potential instrument of her terror. Every rustle in the trees, every creak of a distant wagon wheel, every shadow that moved at the edge of your vision, it all became a part of her machine. For every path northward, she built a path southward. And her path was always wider, always better funded, and always, always waiting. A whisper from the archives, a fragmented deposition from a witness who escaped. They do not take your name. They take the paper with your name on it. Then you are no one. You are only what they say you are. The names of Paddy Cannon's victims exist only as ghosts. They are fragments scattered through dusty court depositions, stray notations in the margins of county records, echoes in the memories of their descendants. But for the vast majority, there is nothing, no trace at all. In a trade built on erasure, their disappearance was the final product. For every person we can name, there are countless others who were utterly and completely deleted from history, their lives extinguished from the page as surely as they were from the road. One name, however, clawed its way out of the silence: Lydia Smith. She was one of the few who survived the machine and lived to testify against the gang. Her words, carried into the official record, are a pinhole of light in an ocean of darkness. Smith described being seized, confined in the tavern, and then transported south. She was a first-hand witness to the inner workings of the kidnapping machine. Her deposition, preserved in brittle, fatting fragments, confirmed what rumor had long suggested: that free black men, women, and even children were not just vulnerable, but were being systematically targeted, hunted like animals. Lydia Smith's survival allowed her voice to remain. Most were not so lucky. They did not live to leave their stories behind. The families were torn apart in broad daylight. Children sent to fetch water or gather firewood would disappear between one breath and the next. A man walking home from the market, his pockets full of coins from a day's work, would find himself seized by strangers, his free papers ripped from his hands and turned to ash. And for the mothers, the fathers, the children left behind, there was a special kind of agony. There was no body to mourn, no grave to visit, no official record to consult. The absence was absolute. The parish ledgers carried no notation of their passing. The census enumerators simply skipped over their names in the next count. The court clerks recorded no deaths. The archive itself, the official memory of the state, seemed to be a co-conspirator in the crime, replacing a human presence with a blank, silent space. Historians, searching these same records centuries later, find only patterns of omission. They find probate records without any listed heirs. They find wills that mention children who simply vanish from all subsequent generations. They find communities that should have grown, but instead they dwindled, their family lines severed by invisible hands. The loss wasn't just of individuals. It was the loss of entire histories, of lineages, of memory itself. The domestic slave trade provided the perfect cover for these erasures. Once a kidnapped free person was transported south, they became utterly indistinguishable from those who were legally enslaved. Their names, if they were recorded at all in the ledgers of the New Orleans or Charleston slave markets, were altered, misspelled, or simply replaced with a generic name like John or Mary. A man who was once a free landowner in Delaware appeared on a bill of sale as nothing more than property, his entire history, his freedom, vanishing as if it had never been. To try and trace such a life backward was nearly impossible. The system was designed, with meticulous cruelty, to prevent it. All that remains are the testimonies of the very few, like Lydia Smith, and the whispers carried by neighbors who were too afraid to speak too loudly. Some recalled seeing children, small children, being marched in chains. Others remembered hearing cries coming from wagons that were covered in canvas, but none of them committed their knowledge to paper. Silence was safer. And so, what was witnessed was never written. What was written was rarely preserved. And what was preserved was tragically, infuriatingly insufficient. You cannot measure the magnitude of this disappearance in numbers because the numbers do not exist. You can only measure it in absence. In the missing names on a family tree, in the broken lines of a community's history, in the parish records that remembered every death from fever but not a single one from kidnapping. You measure it in the way history itself falters, leaving behind only shadows where human lives should be. If the archive could weep, its tears would be the missing names of Patty Cannon's victims. They are the ghosts in the machine of American history, a silence so loud it screams. The tavern at Johnson's Crossroads was a weapon disguised as a building. From the road, it looked unremarkable. Clapboard walls weathered by decades of rain and sun, shutters hanging just slightly uneven, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. But inside that simple wooden frame, there were spaces that were never shown to paying guests. Behind the ordinary doors, beneath the plain wooden beams, existed a series of hidden chambers where freedom and sometimes life itself came to an end. The very architecture of the building was a tool of captivity. Witness accounts, collected years after the fact, spoke of hidden lofts and concealed rooms where captives were held. Survivors described airless compartments, as narrow as horse stalls, where the boards had been nailed shut from the outside to prevent any chance of escape. There were no windows in these spaces. The only light came from the thin cracks between the floorboards, the only air from the gaps in the walls. The silence in these rooms was heavy, suffocating, broken only by muffled cries that would never reach beyond the tavern walls. The building's design served its dark purpose perfectly. A public tavern by day, it became a private prison by night. What looked like a simple storage loft above the main room was, in reality, a holding cell for human beings. The outbuildings, which should have been used for grain or tack, doubled as holding pens. Neighbors, when questioned later, claimed they never heard anything unusual. But this silence wasn't evidence of absence. It was proof of the building's terrifying efficiency. The cries were contained. The walls themselves did the work of complicity. When authorities finally searched the property, long after Cannon was gone, they found the physical proof of these stories. They recovered iron restraints, shackles that had been fastened directly to the wooden beams, chains buried under the dirt floors of the cellar. Fragments of rusted manacles discarded in dark corners like forgotten tools. These objects didn't survive by accident. They endured because the building held them, protecting them long after its occupants were gone. They were mute witnesses to what had been so vehemently denied. Each iron clasp, each rusted link of chain marked a life confined, a name erased, a future undone. The function of these hidden rooms was both practical and commercial. Captives had to be held securely, sometimes for days, until transport south could be arranged. The wagons were not always ready. The ferrymen were not always waiting. The tavern's hidden spaces provided the necessary pause in the supply chain, the grim interval where human beings, neighbors, and citizens were systematically reduced to commodities. The psychological transition from person to property happened in the silent darkness, within walls designed to disguise it. Survivors recalled the smell of close air, of unwashed bodies, of fear. They recalled the constant, dull scrape of chains against wooden beams, the suffocating, total darkness. One woman testified, years later, to hearing the quiet sobs of children hidden in the same space beside her, sounds too faint to be heard beyond the room, yet unforgettable to those who were trapped within it. These details rarely make it into the official archive, but in the scattered depositions, they appear like scars on the page, reminders that the absence was not empty, but was filled with a suffering that was suppressed by timber and earth. Even decades later, when the tavern had fallen into ruin, local memory still spoke of its hidden rooms. Children would dare one another to venture inside, and they would describe a profound sense of unease, a coldness in the spaces where no windows ever admitted light. The recovered shackles gave material proof to these rumors, anchoring the folklore in cold, hard iron. What the stories could not definitively confirm, the objects did. This was no ordinary stop on the road. It was an instrument of commerce, its very beams and floorboards as integral to the human slave trade as the wagons and the ferries. The true horror of these rooms lies in their chilling plainness. They were not elaborate dungeons carved from stone by some Gothic villain. They were ordinary chambers, altered by a simple, evil intent. A wooden beam becomes a place of confinement the moment an iron ring is nailed to it. A storage loft becomes a prison when its ladder is pulled away. An ordinary door becomes the end of a life when it is bolted from the outside. The transformation of the mundane into the apparatus of disappearance, that was Paddy Cannon's true, dark craft. Freedom ended where the tavern walls began. A chilling visual described by a boy who claimed he saw it from a distant field. The wagon did not look heavy, but the horses strained as if pulling a great weight. It was not the weight of goods, it was the weight of secrets. Once darkness fell over Johnson's Crossroads, the tavern transformed yet again. By day, it was a roadside inn. By night, it became the first station in a grim procession that stretched hundreds of miles southward. The wagons would arrive quietly, their wheels muffled by the sandy soil and pine needles of the back roads, their drivers so familiar with the routes they could navigate without lanterns. Inside the tavern, the chains would be unfastened from the beams. One set of restraints was exchanged for another, those more suited for a long journey. The captives were led out of the hidden rooms and into the wagons, which were lined with straw. They were bound in pairs, wrist to wrist, and then covered with a heavy canvas tarp. The journey began not with a judge's sentence, but with the quiet final closing of a wagon door. Neighbors, years later, remembered the sound more than the sight. The slow, rhythmic creak of the wood, the groan of the wheels rolling through the deeply rutted roads. On still nights, they said, the sound of the horses seemed to carry longer than it should have, their hooves falling in a heavy rhythm, as if they were pulling a burden far greater than their manifest would suggest. The wagons seldom moved in daylight. When they did, no one dared to ask what they carried. It was simply safer not to know. In these borderlands, silence was not a sign of ignorance. It was a strategy for survival. The routes southward were chosen with a predator's care. Main roads risked questions from sheriffs or patrols. The back roads offered concealment. The pine thickets and the sandy, untraveled tracks provided perfect cover until the rivers could be reached. At the Nanticoke or the Choptank, the flatboat ferries would be waiting. These ferrymen transported the wagons across the dark water without a hint of curiosity. They were compensated not for their labor, but for their deliberate blindness. Once they reached the opposite bank, the wagons would resume their journey, the captives still hidden beneath the canvas, until they could be transferred to schooners waiting further downstream in the Chesapeake ports. Those schooners were the final link in the chain of erasure. Outwardly, they carried the normal goods of the region, tobacco, grain, lumber. But hidden in their holds there was another cargo. The shackled captives, purchased or stolen from the borderlands, were loaded discreetly, often at night at private docks away from the main harbor. These vessels would then set sail for the southern markets, for places like Charleston or New Orleans, where questions were few and the profit was certain. These ships completed what the wagons had begun. Once the river gave way to the open sea, there was no possibility of return. The process was chillingly systematic. Each step flowed seamlessly into the next with the cold, unfeeling efficiency of commerce. The tavern concealed, the wagons transported, the ferries crossed, the schooners carried. At no point did this chain of human misery require a spectacle. Its strength was in its silence, in its appearance of normality. Every single participant, the wagoner, the ferryman, the ship's captain, played their part, whether motivated by profit or by fear. Each one made a choice not to see, not to speak, not to write down what they had witnessed. The disappearance of hundreds of lives depended less on brute force and more on the collective, crushing weight of this shared silence. Occasionally, a neighbor would glance from a window as one of the wagons rolled past in the moonlight. They would note the late hour, the southern direction, the steady, heavy pace of the wheels. Yet no testimony ever surfaced in a court. No written record was ever made in the parish books. No names were ever passed into the official ledgers. Their private observations became private memories, never transformed into public evidence. In this way, the borderland itself colluded in the crime, its residents choosing the safety of absence over the danger of truth. The captives themselves left almost no trace. Their voices were smothered beneath the heavy canvas, their movements obscured by darkness, their fates sealed by the ferries and schooners that erased the line between free soil and the slave market. The wagons carried them out of their community, out of memory, and out of the historical record. All that remained behind was the faint, haunting sound of wheels on a dirt road, a sound that was remembered far too late to matter. Crimes on the scale of the Cannon-Johnson gang's operation could not endure for 2 decades without notice. It is a simple, logical impossibility. The neighbors saw the wagons. The ferrymen knew what they were carrying. The local sheriffs were well aware of the dark reputation of Johnson's crossroads, and yet the machine continued to run, year after year, with impunity. The explanation for this is not some great mystery. It is something far more common and far more damning. It is economics. Silence was not a natural state in the borderlands. It was a product that was bought and sold, and the silence endured because it was immensely profitable for a great many people. The slave traders, the middlemen who connected Cannon to the southern markets, were enriched by her work. Each captive she delivered southward fetched a handsome price, sometimes hundreds of dollars. In an economy where small farmers were scraping a meager living from poor soil, a sum like that could exceed months, or even a year, of honest labor. The traders who dealt directly with Cannon had absolutely no incentive to question the source of her captives. Paperwork could be easily fabricated. Explanations could be supplied. Any nagging doubts could be suppressed by the weight of gold coin. What mattered was the delivery of the product. The tavern itself profited directly from the trade, laundering the criminal activity through its legitimate business. The meals served to the wagoners, the stables rented to their horses, the rooms let to those involved in the transport. Every transaction folded the criminal commerce into the fabric of ordinary business. Guests would sit drinking ale at tables, separated only by a thin wall from chained prisoners. The tavern's ledger would record the coin received, but it would never note the human cost. It was the perfect illusion, the shadow of disappearance translated into the cold, hard currency of daily life. Sheriffs and magistrates were not blind. Complaints did occasionally surface. Rumors spread. Whispered depositions were sometimes taken. Yet official investigations were almost unheard of and prosecutions were even rarer. In some cases, officials were likely paid off directly, their silence purchased with a share of the profits. In other cases, neglect was its own form of profit. Turning away from the evidence spared the county the expense and trouble of a difficult inquiry, and it preserved the fragile peace of a community that was unwilling to confront its own deep-seated complicity. Law was not absent at Johnson's crossroads. It was willfully withheld. Gold buys a short silence, but fear buys a long one. This was an old proverb of the borderlands, a piece of folk wisdom that explained how the world worked. Fear reinforced what money had begun. Those who questioned the operation too loudly, who pushed for answers, risked retaliation. Patty Cannon's reputation for severity extended far beyond the walls of her tavern. The neighbors knew she was not a woman to be challenged. Her network had deep roots, and its methods were not subtle. To resist her was to invite danger, not just to your livelihood but to your family, perhaps even to your life. And so the silence that was first bought with gold soon hardened into a habit, and that habit over 2 decades calcified into a culture. Gold paid for discretion. Fear ensured that discretion would last. The circulation of coin from this shadow economy left no clear ledger trail, yet its influence can be traced, not in what is written, but in what is missing. It can be seen in the parish books that omit any mention of children who vanished overnight. It can be seen in the court dockets that fall silent right where a deposition against the gang should appear. The absence of evidence was not an oversight. It was a purchase. Gold erased the need for the clerks to write. The result is a history that must be measured as much by its gaping holes as by what little survives. In the larger economy of the domestic slave trade, Patty Cannon's operation was a small but steady tributary, feeding into a much larger river. The demand for bodies in the Deep South never faltered, and her regular shipments of stolen free people helped fill the gap left by the end of the international trade. The Southern buyers paid readily, the middlemen took their cut, and Cannon received her share. Each transaction represented the alchemical transformation of freedom into money, of humanity into coin. The mechanics of her survival, of her 20-year reign of terror, rested not on secrecy, but on a widespread, deeply rooted complicity. Almost everyone near Johnson's Crossroads knew something, and most of them knew enough. But silence was cheaper and safer than confrontation, and a pocket full of coin made it easier still. The community did not fail to see what was happening. It made a collective, unspoken decision to look away. Her gold bought their silence, and their silence bought her time, 20 years of it. Kidnapping was the known crime, the public secret of the Cannon-Johnson gang. It was the engine of their profit. But beneath the hum of that machine, there were whispers of something darker, something more final. Even before the official discovery in 1829, rumors had circulated for years of bodies being buried on Patty Cannon's land, of skeletal remains being found when a nearby field was plowed, of stories of children who didn't vanish into the backs of wagons but into the ground itself. These were not tales of isolated violence, of a crime committed in the heat of the moment. They suggested a routine, a policy, an acceptance that the cost of doing business sometimes required not just abduction, but murder. The neighbors spoke of it quietly, in hushed tones. They spoke of the children who simply never reappeared. A young boy sent to run an errand, seen for a moment at the tavern and then never again. A girl carried away, her voice heard crying one night, only to be silenced completely by the morning. Their names rarely entered any official record. In the parish ledgers they left no trace. In the census tallies they disappeared without a single note of explanation. Yet in the collective memory of the community they lingered. They were recalled in fragmented stories, retold in hushed tones whenever Patty Cannon's name was spoken. The ground itself, on occasion, seemed to betray her secrets. Accounts survive of bones being unearthed by accident years before Cannon's arrest. A farmer's plow turns up a skull. A ditch digger finds a rib cage. The remains are identified as human, and then just as quickly they are quietly returned to the earth. No formal inquiry ever followed. Silence was easier, safer than acknowledgement. Were the bones those of captured fugitives who had resisted, or were they the bones of local children who had seen too much? The question was left deliberately unanswered. The soil became the only witness, and it was a witness that was easily ignored. Violence within Cannon's operation wasn't an aberration. It was a matter of policy. It was risk management. Those who resisted their chains, those who tried to flee, or those whose free papers and connections threatened to complicate a quick and easy resale, they were silenced. A body buried on her land left no difficult questions for the ferrymen, no unexpected delays for the wagoners, and no potential disputes for the buyers in the South. Murder was not a spectacle. It was just good management. Each killing smoothed the path for profit. It removed an obstacle that coin alone could not erase. Witness testimony, given decades later, confirmed that violence was a constant presence. Survivors spoke of brutal beatings. They spoke of those who collapsed during the forced marches southward, being left to die on the side of the road. They spoke of captives who simply did not survive the horrific conditions of their confinement in the tavern's hidden rooms. Some even claimed to have seen the shallow graves near the tavern with their own eyes. They described patches of earth, freshly turned, in places where no crops were ever planted. Others told of a strange, sweet smell of decay that would sometimes carry on the wind from her yard. These details remain uncorroborated by the official court records, of course, but their consistency across multiple, independent accounts suggests something more than mere invention. The absence of written proof does not erase the likelihood of the truth. Silence served the exact same role here as it did in the kidnappings. The local officials did not investigate the rumors of graves. The neighbors did not record what they saw. The court clerks did not write down the whispers. Absence was convenient for everyone, and that absence left a vacuum, a space for the rumors to grow, to fester. In this void, the whispers carried, and they filled the silence with a speculation that may have come far closer to the horrifying reality than the official archives ever would. By the time the authorities were finally forced to excavate Paddy Cannon's property in 1829, they uncovered physical remains that confirmed what had been spoken of in hushed tones for a generation. But by then, decades of whispers had hardened into a kind of local law. The discovery wasn't a revelation. For those who had lived in the shadow of the tavern, it was merely a confirmation of a truth they had long been too afraid to speak aloud. The killings were not a legend. They were a business practice, folded into the cold, efficient machinery of kidnapping and sale. Violence ensured efficiency, and when the profit required absolute silence, the ground became her final bookkeeper. In April of 1829, the whispers finally gave way to undeniable physical evidence. For years, the rumors had circulated of shallow graves near Paddy Cannon's tavern, of disturbed earth, of bones glimpsed and then quickly forgotten. But when a tenant farmer plowing a field on her land unearthed not one, but multiple skeletons, the silence that had protected her for 20 years could no longer be maintained. What the neighbors had feared, and what the authorities had systematically ignored, now rose visibly from the ground, demanding to be seen. The remains were not of one person, nor were they all of one age. The authorities who were called to the scene recorded the bones of men, women, and, most disturbingly, children, all tangled together in the soil that seemed to give up its dark contents with great reluctance. Some of the skeletons bore the unmistakable marks of violence, skulls with fractures, bones with breaks that suggested brutal blows rather than the gentle decay of time. Other skeletons were so small, so fragile, they could only have belonged to children. The sheer variety of the ages of the dead testified to the indiscriminate, almost casual nature of the crimes. It seemed that resistance, vulnerability, or simple inconvenience had all been answered in the exact same way, with death in a shallow, unmarked grave. The local officials could no longer avert their eyes. The discovery had occurred in plain sight, in front of witnesses far too numerous to silence or intimidate. What had long been whispered in the privacy of homes was now an undeniable public fact, exposed to the light of day. The law, which had looked away for decades, was now forced at last to look down into the earth. Sussex County authorities convened their inquiries, their official records noting the presence of the skeletal remains, but they were utterly unable to provide any names. The bones could speak of violence, but the archive could not translate their stories. The neighbors reacted with a grim mixture of shock and morbid confirmation. Many admitted, now that it was safe to do so, that they had long suspected such findings. They admitted that the endless parade of wagons and the occasional muffled cries had always implied an outcome far darker than just captivity and sale. Yet, to see the bones laid out on the ground, that was to confront the reality that their collective silence had concealed. It was no longer a rumor. It was evidence, as undeniable as the rusted shackles that were found alongside them. The land itself had become the key witness, in a place where people had refused to testify. The parish ledgers had omitted the dead, the census records had erased them, the court dockets had ignored them, but the soil could not be bribed. Its memory was longer and more patient than that of any human institution. It held on to what had been discarded by the record keepers. Each shallow grave was a ledger entry, written not in ink but in bone. And yet, even in this moment of discovery, the investigation was strangely limited. The authorities recovered what they could easily find. They recorded what was immediately visible, but they stopped short of a full, systematic excavation of the entire property. Some graves likely remained untouched, others were only partially exhumed. The total number of victims could never be fixed with any certainty. Estimates circulated wildly, from a dozen to more than 30, but precision was impossible. In this way, even in the moment of exposure, the culture of silence persisted. The dead were finally acknowledged, but they were not fully counted. Their individuality was surrendered to a collective, horrifying anonymity. Yet the shock of the discovery was sufficient to force legal action. Patty Cannon, who had so long been shielded by a wall of silence and complicity, could not continue her operations under the weight of so many unearthed bodies. The unearthing of the remains transformed her, almost overnight, from a whispered local menace into a public, notorious criminal. Indictments followed swiftly. 4 counts of murder were formally charged against her, though the witnesses and the neighbors suggested that the true number of deaths was far, far higher. The soil had finally succeeded where 2 decades of human testimony and whispered rumor had failed. The unearthed bones were not simply evidence of murder. They were proof of how deeply the system of erasure had failed. For decades, absence had been her greatest ally, hiding her victims from the historical record. But in the spring of 1829, the earth itself violently disrupted that absence, presenting to the world what the official archive had so long refused to hold. It was not a human witness who finally spoke the truth. It was the soil itself. The unearthed bones forced a reckoning that rumor alone never could, an arrest. In the spring of 1829, Patty Cannon was finally taken into custody. She was indicted on 4 specific counts of murder, the charges drawn directly from the skeletons that had been uncovered on her land. But the number that was spoken in whispers around the county, in taverns and on front porches, was far higher. Neighbors claimed she was responsible for at least 20 deaths. Some suggested it was many more. The formal indictment was just a fraction of the truth, a pale shadow of the real horror, but it was enough. It was enough to remove her from her throne at the tavern at Johnson's Crossroads and place her behind the cold, iron bars of the Sussex County Jail. The news of her arrest traveled like wildfire across Delaware and Maryland. Newspapers, which had been silent about her for years, suddenly carried the story in bold headlines. Their columns filled with lurid descriptions of the discovery of the bones, the details of the indictments, and the biography of the woman at the center of it all. For years, she had been a figure of rumor, a local boogeyman whose name was muttered with a mixture of fear and unease. Now she stood identified and condemned by the state, her complex crimes reduced to a few stark lines of text in an official record. The shock for the community lay not in her capture, but in the staggering fact that it had taken so long. Cannon's confinement in the Sussex County Jail quickly became a public spectacle. Crowds began to gather outside the jail, not in protest or pity, but in a kind of morbid fascination. Some came just to see the woman who had haunted the borderlands for a generation. Others came to satisfy themselves that she was truly contained, that the powerful silence which had shielded her for 2 decades had finally been broken. She drew neither sympathy nor mercy from the crowds. What she commanded, even in chains, was a grim curiosity, the kind of attention reserved for figures who pass from the realm of rumor into the hard, undeniable world of evidence. The jail itself seemed to groan under the weight of her presence. The official records note her confinement, the mundane routine of custody that reduced a woman who had once commanded a vast criminal network to a simple inmate, under constant watch. She had bound hundreds of others in chains. Now, iron bound her. The stark symmetry of her fate was not lost on those who recorded it. It was written into the very language of the newspaper reports, which remarked on this dramatic reversal of fortune with a tone of measured, righteous satisfaction. Yet even with her arrest, a profound uncertainty remained. The four indictments represented only the bodies that had been accidentally uncovered. But how many more lay hidden in undiscovered graves? How many more had been erased entirely, their bodies sold south, their fates unknown? Witnesses spoke of children who vanished without a trace, of captives who never even made it to the wagons, of cries that were heard one night and then abruptly silenced. But rumor, no matter how persistent, could not be translated into a formal charge. The legal system, which had conveniently ignored her crimes for decades, now had her confined, but it was only willing to act on the evidence that it could not possibly deny. The rest of the truth remained unspoken, left to linger in the suffocating silence of the past. A deep unease began to settle over the community in the weeks that followed her arrest. Some people began to fear what a public trial might reveal. They worried that Cannon's testimony, if she chose to speak, could implicate dozens of others. The wagoners, the ferrymen, the southern traders, perhaps even local officials who had profited from her reign of silence. A trial threatened to expose the entire web of complicity that had allowed her to operate for so long. Others feared retribution. What if her network remained active, even with her behind bars? The borderlands, so long accustomed to the quiet corruption of complicity, now had to confront the terrifying prospect of exposure. What had been whispered in private was now a public matter, printed in black ink for the entire world to read. In the end, her arrest was less a conclusion to the story and more of an interruption. It marked the collapse of her personal freedom, but it did not represent a full reckoning for her crimes. She had built an entire business on the principle of absence, the absence of names, the absence of records, the absence of bodies. And even in custody, locked in a jail cell, that absence remained her most powerful and steadfast ally. The bones had forced the state to act, but they could not summon the dead to testify against her. Her chains had bound hundreds. Now they finally bound her, but the story was far from over. Patty Cannon never stood before a jury. She never spoke her crimes into the official record. What survives of her voice comes to us only through the second-hand reports of others. It's a collection of fragments, phrases printed in sensationalist newspapers, words allegedly repeated by her jailers, sentences carried on the wind of rumor. Together, these fragments form the rough, shadowy outline of a confession, but never its full shape. And the gaps in that outline, they speak far louder than what remains. The accounts from 1829 suggest that while in jail, Cannon admitted to far more murders than the four listed in her indictment. Local papers eagerly carried the claim that she had confessed to many more deaths than could ever be proven, her own tongue finally acknowledging a scale of horror that the state had dared not quantify. Some reports placed the number at a dozen. Others claimed it was closer to 20. One particularly sensational account suggested that nearly 30 lives had been ended either by her own hand or under her direct order. With each repetition, the figure seemed to grow higher, pushing the story further into the realm of the unthinkable. And yet, none of these accounts preserve her exact words. They are all hearsay, dressed up as history. They are shadow passed off as substance. The official records of the Sussex County Jail note her confinement, but no transcript of any formal confession exists. What is certain is that conversations occurred. Conversations between Cannon and her jailers, between Cannon and the morbidly curious visitors who came to see her, between Cannon and the suffocating silence of her own cell. And into those spaces, speculation rushed in. Did she boast of her crimes? Did she exaggerate the numbers as a final act of psychological terror? Or did she, near the end of her life, simply abandon the burden of concealment? The archive offers no answer. The newspapers filled that vacuum with their own competing versions of the truth. One paper described her as being utterly undaunted, speaking without a hint of remorse about the bodies she had buried near her tavern. Another painted a portrait of a weary, broken woman, admitting only reluctantly to what had long been suspected. A third cast her as being cunningly evasive, dropping hints about the numbers but refusing to elaborate, playing a final, manipulative game with her captors. Each portrait contradicts the others, leaving the reader forever uncertain of whether they are encountering a moment of truth, a calculated performance, or a pure journalistic invention. These confessions in shadow mattered less for what they confirmed, and more for what they suggested. By admitting to more than just the 4 murders, Cannon validated the whispers that had circulated for years. She acknowledged, at least in part, that the graves were numerous, that the victims were more than the soil had yet revealed. In doing so, she provided a grim confirmation for the neighbors who had long suspected the true scale of her operation, but had always lacked the proof or the courage to say so. Her words, if indeed they were hers, carried the weight of a final witness, even if that witness was still shrouded in ambiguity. What remains so striking, so haunting, is how little of her own voice survives with any clarity. Here was a woman accused of 4 murders, rumored to have committed dozens, who spoke words that should have defined the historical record. Instead, those words were allowed to dissipate, to break apart into half-remembered phrases and unattributed quotes. No court clerk ever preserved them. No official deposition ever captured them. They exist only as echoes, bouncing through the pages of old newspapers, and each echo slightly distorts the original sound until it can no longer be separated from the noise of invention. This absence is not accidental. You have to understand that a full, formal confession would have forced a much wider and much more uncomfortable reckoning. A reckoning with the true number of the dead. A reckoning with the deep complicity of those who had enabled her for so long. A reckoning with the 2 decades of institutional silence. These fragmented, rumored confessions served another, more convenient purpose. They acknowledged just enough of the horror to satisfy the public's morbid interest, while leaving the full truth conveniently and permanently obscured. Patty Cannon's crimes could remain monstrous in rumor, without ever requiring the state to account for every missing name, every uncounted body, every erased life. A complete ledger of her killings does not exist. Instead, there is only a shadow ledger. Its entries are guessed at by neighbors, inflated by journalists, whispered by jailers. It has no ink. It is measured only in absence, in vanished lives. On May 11, 1829, Patty Cannon was found dead in her cell at the Sussex County Jail. The woman who had bound so many others in chains was now stilled, not by the judgment of the court, but by a poison that was said to have been smuggled to her. Her trial had not yet begun. The indictments were ready. The witnesses were prepared to testify, but Patty Cannon never entered the courtroom. Silence, which had once been her most effective weapon, now became her final, definitive act. The official records note her death with a stark, bureaucratic plainness. No transcript of a last confession exists. No final testimony from her lips survives. Instead, the official story simply ends. It ends with a body in a cell, a vial of poison that was suspected but never officially catalogued, and a community that was left to interpret this final absence as a conclusion. The newspapers reported the fact of her death, and each paper added its own layer of speculation. Some called it suicide, a deliberate, calculated choice to avoid the public shame of a trial and execution. Others hinted at something more sinister. They suggested that she was assisted, that her permanent silence served the interests of more people than just herself. The debate has never been settled. Suicide remains the simplest and most accepted explanation. A woman who was so accustomed to absolute command might have chosen to end her own life, on her own terms, rather than face the humiliation of a public judgment. In this version of the story, the poison is an act of control, a final assertion of her will against a system that had, at last, turned against her. She denied the state the satisfaction of its spectacle. She refused to let them parade her crimes in open court, to formally mark her name with a conviction. But another, darker interpretation has always lingered in the shadows. The idea that her death was just too convenient. A public trial might have revealed far too much. Not only the true number of her victims, but the deep, damning complicity of those who had profited from her 20 years of silence. The wagoners, the ferrymen, the southern traders, perhaps even respected local officials, all of them could have been implicated by her testimony. A sudden, unexplained death in a jail cell spared them all from that exposure. It neatly reduced the entire sprawling scandal to a single, monstrous figure, safely contained and now silenced within a cell. The network, the system that had enabled her, remained unexamined, its links severed not by a thorough investigation, but by a vial of poison. The true psychological weight of her end lies in what it prevented. A courtroom would have forced her to speak. She would have been compelled, however reluctantly, to answer questions, to look her accusers in the eye, to respond to the testimony of witnesses, judges, and juries. The public would have finally heard the names, the places, and perhaps the numbers that rumor alone could never fully establish. Instead, her voice ended abruptly, in silence, leaving only the fragmented, unreliable stories repeated by others. The absence of a trial became one more act of erasure, a final, fitting continuation of the pattern that had defined her entire life's work. The jail itself offered little context. The Sussex County records preserved the date of her death, and almost nothing more. No official autopsy was ever performed. No formal inquiry ever traced the origin of the poison. The state simply accepted her death as a conclusion, rather than as a new and troubling complication. It allowed her crimes to remain partially obscured, her victims to remain unnamed, her network to remain unexamined. In the end, Patty Cannon entered history not through the formal, detailed record of a trial, but through the same void of absence that she had created for so many others. An absence she either chose for herself, with her own hand, or one that was chosen for her, with the assistance of those who had too much to lose. The silence that had protected her for decades in life now accompanied her into death, shielding forever the truths that could not be spoken. She chose to bury herself before history could. Patty Cannon's death in 1829 left behind more silence than it did record. The archive preserved only the barest of fragments, the indictments for 4 murders, a few scattered newspaper clippings, the whispered rumors of a confession. And into that vast, gaping vacuum, fiction rushed in to fill the space. Where the historical documents had failed, stories and legends eagerly took up the task of explaining the horror. In the years that followed, her crimes became the raw material for folklore, reworked and embellished until the figure of Patty Cannon bore as much resemblance to invention as she did to fact. The most enduring and the most distorting of these fictions came in 1882, with the publication of The Entailed Hat, a novel by George Alfred Townsend, a journalist who turned to fiction. Townsend wove the known history of Patty Cannon into a sprawling, Gothic tale of abduction, murder, and grotesque villainy. His novel cast her as a figure larger than life, a monstrous, almost mythical embodiment of pure cruelty, and the public devoured it. For many, Townsend's sensationalist fiction became the definitive account of her life, completely eclipsing the sparse and unsatisfying official record. The exaggerations in the novel were vivid and lurid. Cannon was depicted as a physically brutal woman, personally wielding weapons, committing murders with her own hands in ways that were entirely unsupported by the historical evidence. Scenes of torture and grand theatrical spectacle filled the pages, appealing to a public that was hungry for sensation. The quiet, methodical reality of her crimes, the hidden rooms, the muffled cries, the wagons in the night, the bodies in the shallow graves, was horrific enough in its chilling plainness. But Townsend replaced that cold, systemic silence with a loud, bloody spectacle. He reshaped a story of systematic erasure into a piece of lurid, Gothic entertainment. Local folklore followed a similar path. All across Delaware and Maryland, stories began to circulate of Patty Cannon's ghost, haunting the crossroads, of her angry specter wandering the fields where the bones had been found. Children were warned not to linger near the ruins of her old tavern, told that they might hear the ghostly cries of her vanished victims, or glimpse her dark shadow moving among the trees. Each new generation retold these tales, adding their own embellishments. Fact blurred into legend, until the distinction between the two mattered very little. These ghost stories did what the official records had not. They kept her name alive, but they did so at a terrible cost. The focus of the story shifted entirely, from the forgotten victims to the unforgettable villain, from the hundreds of people who disappeared into her machine to the one woman who was remembered for orchestrating it all. Folklore, in its own way, performed the same function as the silence had. It turned Patty Cannon into a singular, grotesque symbol, which left the erased lives of her victims in an even deeper shadow. It diverted our attention away from those who could not speak for themselves, and focused it instead on the monster. The contradictions between the archive and the folklore are stark. The historical record suggests a woman of ordinary, even plain appearance. Stern, silent, and running her criminal operation with a cold, businesslike efficiency. The myth, on the other hand, presents us with a grotesque caricature, a monstrous figure, theatrical in her cruelty. One is chilling because it is so believable, so plain. The other is chilling because it is so exaggerated. And together, they tell us less about the real Patty Cannon and more about the culture that chose to remember her. By the end of the 19th century, Patty Cannon was no longer simply a historical criminal. She had become a figure of American folklore, a regional villain to be invoked whenever the silence of the past felt inadequate. Her story traveled through novels, through ghost tales, through local historical sketches that mingled truth and fiction so thoroughly that neither could ever be cleanly separated again. The result was a history that was written in a darker ink, not because the archive had preserved it, but precisely because the archive had failed to. When the archive falters, folklore is what writes our history, and it always writes with a darker ink. The story of Patty Cannon ends not in testimony, not in the formal order of a court, but in a profound and permanent absence. Her death in that jail cell in 1829 closed the door on the possibility of a trial. No official transcript was ever produced. No cross-examination was ever preserved. No final roster of her victims was ever entered into the historical record. What remains of her in the official archives of Maryland and Delaware are just fragments, indictments for 4 murders, a handful of scattered newspaper clippings, and a few depositions from the very, very few who survived to speak. These scraps of paper form the outline of an atrocity, but the center of the story remains hollow, empty. The erasure of Patty Cannon herself was never complete. Her name appears in history books, in novels, in folklore. She was remembered, distorted, and retold. But what did not endure were the names of those she had erased. Her victims remain almost entirely anonymous, their identities lost forever in the deep, deliberate silence of the parish ledgers and the census rolls. Even when their bodies were finally uncovered on her land, they entered the official record only as skeletal remains, not as individuals. They were reduced to bones in the soil, stripped of their identity long before the archive could ever mark their existence. And this imbalance. This is the deeper crime. Cannon's notoriety endured because her story could be written, but the stories of those she captured, sold, or buried were unwritten, because they were unwritable within a system that was designed from top to bottom to erase them. A free black man's paper could be burned in an instant, and with it, his entire legal identity. A child taken from the roadside left no probate record to be contested. A woman who vanished into the hold of a schooner was never entered into a passenger ledger. Erasure was not an accidental byproduct of her crimes. It was the essential function. It was the core machinery of her commerce. The Maryland State Archives and the Delaware Public Archives preserve what little exists. They contain the notices of her arrest, the copies of the indictments, and the fragments of testimony. But none of them hold a complete record of her crimes. The absence is conspicuous, but it is not unique. The entire domestic slave trade relied on this very same void. Names dissolved into prices. Identities dissolved into property. Once sold south, a free man from the borderlands might reappear on a bill of sale under a completely different name, indistinguishable from those who had been born into bondage. The line of his history ended forever at her tavern door. The institutional silence outlived her. It ensured that the true, staggering scale of her crimes could never be fully known. The state confined her, and then it allowed her to die before she could ever speak in a court of law. The ground revealed the bones of her victims, but the state did not catalog them with care. Even that final act of discovery stopped short, leaving graves uncounted, their occupants anonymous. The very same silence that had enabled her commerce for 20 years became the silence that now defines her legacy. For the historian, for anyone who looks back into this story, the archive is less a record of events and more a field of gaping holes. It tells us that Patty Cannon existed. It tells us she was arrested and that she died. But it does not tell us who she took. It does not tell us who she sold. And it does not tell us who she buried. It does not give names to the children who never returned home or to the families that were severed in broad daylight. These gaps in the record are not neutral. They are themselves a form of testimony. They are the proof that erasure was the business and silence was its enduring and most profitable currency. History did not bury Patty Cannon. It buried those she erased and then forgot where the graves lay. This story isn't just about one monstrous woman from a distant past. It's a chilling reminder of how easily systems of silence and complicity can allow darkness to thrive, hidden in plain sight. It's about how quickly and completely history can be erased when profit and fear conspire to look the other way. The land remembers, the bones remember, even when the books are empty. So the question isn't just what she did, but how a whole society agreed to forget. What other stories, what other names are buried in the silences of our own history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've come this far, you're not just a watcher. You're becoming part of the story, part of the remembering. Subscribe and turn on notifications so we can continue to walk these shadow paths together. The truth bleeds through if you know where to look.